I'm going to read. I'm going to read now what is probably a very familiar parable. Luke 15, verses 11 to 32. And Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. June, is that still a bit too bright? Okay. Can we have? Okay, thanks. Okay. That's all right. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. And he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. He was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his older son was in the field. As he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come. Your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I've served you. I've never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. When this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and to be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. When planning this particular parable for this particular Sunday, I think I could probably have worked it out that in the preceding week, we would have had a new Prime Minister installed. But that was not really any big deal. As you've probably been reminded this week, that now makes the 4th Prime Minister in 6 years. David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson. Honestly, do you think he's trying to do a Theresa May hairdo then? And now Liz Truss. What I couldn't have worked out, of course, is that the whole country would just have gone through the shock for what most of us will find a far more momentous transition. For the first time in the lives of most of the citizens of this country, we have to dig out the old version of the national anthem. God save our gracious King. That's going to take a while to get used to. Thy choicest gifts in store on him. Be pleased to pour, isn't it? It's quite possible that with that now being summarized as God save our gracious King, some people will pray that particular line of that prayer that is our national anthem even more urgently and literally, now that Queen Elizabeth II has been succeeded by King Charles III. So there's been an awful lot of talk about legacy on the news this week. In fact, I think I heard I'm still calling Prince Charles, King Charles, saying on an interview probably just yesterday, I'm very aware of the inheritance. The news bulletins on Tuesday included the not particularly comforting news that our new Prime Minister was given the nuclear codes on her way back from Balmoral. She's also, I guess, inherited the famous number 10 cat. But I say inherit there, but it's not technically the correct usage, is it? More strictly, it applies to certain things that are passed on only at death. So I guess that would include various palaces and castles. Prince William has now become heir to the throne. He becomes Prince of Wales and Ducal, as well as Cambridge. That's feeling a bit greedy. But the parable that we're looking at this morning also greatly features legacy, but not appreciated, not understood, as King Charles says he does. And a legacy in the parable demanded before its time too, and then, even worse, squandered. We usually hear it referred to as the parable of the prodigal son. And I thought I'd better check up because that's an unusual word there, prodigal. Here's your official dictionary definition: spending money or using resources freely and recklessly, extravagantly wasteful. But I think that the name, the prodigal son, for this parable, misunderstands the parable rather seriously. We could stop reading halfway through and it would be okay, and because it's tidy enough if we were to stop at verse 24, for this my son was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. If the parable stopped there, then it is the parable of the prodigal son. In fact, I think there is precisely where Jesus was tricking his hearers into thinking he was finishing. I'll tell you precisely why I'm sure of that in a few minutes. But there is an enormous sting in the tail here. The son who went away to a far country, the one who was prodigal, that's the lost son, isn't it? But here's a good, fine, dutiful son who didn't do that. The one who stayed at home and kept the family business going. He deserves a pat on the back, surely, unlike that young wretch. It turns out that the parable is about two lost sons. It's still about being prodigal, but it's not the boy who is prodigal, it is the father. Lavish and extravagant with grace towards both of them. But Jesus leaves it hanging in the air as to whether both responded to and received that grace. Like some of the other parables that are mini stories, instead of just snapshots, we're left with a question instead of a conclusion. Remember, they're fiction. These things didn't really happen. So to say, but what did happen next is a bit of a silly question. So instead, maybe Jesus leaves it hanging in the air, not us waiting, are we going to have the prodigal son 2, the film sort of thing? But instead, it's a question pointing at us who are listening. Not what happened to them in the end. But so just as how does this relate to me? Which of the two sons in this story am I, or am I more like? When you've answered that one, what difference does that make to the way you're going to live from now on? We need to start this story, though, back a bit, not where I started, because this is not a standalone parable as I've read it. We need to get back to the beginning of the chapter to make most sense of the end of it. So Luke sets the scene for us, and what he says is very significant. Here's Luke 15, verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear Jesus. We're probably familiar with that kind of scenario. We can picture it happening. Remember from previous weeks and the series of parables that we've looked at, that tax collectors in this context are universally hated by the common people of Judea. I won't go into the details, but they are. And sinners, and maybe we should put that in quote marks, would mean people who generally have been known to have committed what you might call scandalous sins. What we've got here are the kind of people that respectable people would feel justified in keeping their distance from and very happily look down their noses at. But Jesus didn't. And that scandalized the overtly religious people. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." And that forms the foundation for the rest of the chapter. We might see it in our Bibles as 3 separate parables, but folks, remember that the titles you get in the Bible are not part of the Bible. They are additions by the translating committee or some other group of people. The original writers did not put headings in. That's down to other people more recently. And sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're unhelpful. Just notice 2 little, but I think significant things in the next verse. So he told them this parable. First, so, it's a joining word. This parable is in response to what Luke has just written. Because this had happened, because these people said this to Jesus, because of that, he told this parable. It is a response to what they said, and we need to read it as such. And second, it says this parable, not these parables. The rest of the chapter is one parable with 3 episodes. The first 2 prepare us for the third, and I think Jesus is deliberately wrong-footing us with the first 2, so that the conclusion to the third one is going to hit us even harder. So I'm going to run over the initial 2 very quickly just to show you the pattern, only to remember Jesus is going to break this pattern deliberately later on. So first of all, there's the lost sheep, verses 4 to 7. And here's your pattern. First, lost. Second, searched. Third, found. Fourth, rejoiced. Here it is in the lost sheep. Slightly busy on the screen. You don't need the lights off of that. But you might just be able to see in yellow. If he has lost one of them, does he not go after? And when he has found it, this sounds like Jeremy Clarkson going through the fastest finger first, doesn't it? And then lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. There are those 4 points. And in fact, you notice there's an awful lot of rejoicing there. Same with episode 2, the lost coin, verses 8 to 10. If she loses one coin, she seeks diligently, and when she has found it, saying, rejoice. And again, there's a lot of rejoicing happening here. And actually, says Jesus, it's not just rejoicing on earth. He's already starting to spiritualize this by saying there's joy in heaven over sinners repenting. Implication, I think, shouldn't earth follow on from heaven's example? What if these sinners, Jesus is at least hinting, what if these sinners that he's mingling with were repenting and coming back to God? Implication, isn't that cause for a celebration rather than a snub? But then he moves straight on to his not third parable, the third episode of this one parable. And we've got this pattern fixed in our heads now. We know the tune, we know what's coming, don't we? Well, that's what Jesus is leading us to. And it's a bit more elaborate now, but look carefully. You can still see those same 4 points. So it's the same story. First of all, here's someone lost. 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. Now that's already pretty scandalous. It's son saying to father that the only value he puts on that relationship is cash value. I would inherit this much when you die, and since you're so inconveniently still alive, you're just going to have to sell 1/3 of your goods. Remember, the oldest son would get a double share. Sell 1/3 and give me the proceeds. To a good, self-respecting Jewish hearer, they would already seriously dislike this disrespectful younger son. They will probably feel at this point, disinheritance is what is called for. This son is pretty much lost already. But no, there's more lostness to come as Jesus develops the story, because first the money goes. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And then circumstances change and he becomes even more lost. I suspect all of the friends that he had bought suddenly disappear, wouldn't you? When he'd spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country and he began to be in need. I bet he did. And look where he ends up, in a pigsty. Remember the Jewish context? Now, not just in a pigsty, but envying the pigs. At that point, Jesus' hearers would have been chortling, nodding their heads with approval. This father dishonoring, awful man has got his deserved comeuppance. Good stuff, Jesus. I like this story. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country who sent him into the field to feed pigs. He was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs had. No one gave him anything. Good, like this. But this is not an inanimate coin. It's not a brainless sheep. A plan starts to take place in this lad's head as he stands hunched over his aching belly. Here's maybe how I could wheedle my way back in. And he starts to compose his speech. And Jesus, in this wonderful way he tells the story, looks inside his head and reads the words that are starting to form. He's starting to compose a speech. He wants to cut a deal with his dad. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired servants. So he starts the weary journey back, and I suspect he rehearses this until it's word perfect. It's not quite back home. He was hoping for a job rather than a reception. But he finds that on the way home, instead of his dad washing his hands of this ingrate, Dad has been searching. Lost, searched for. He's waiting. He's hoping. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him. Isn't it strange how you can sometimes tell someone from their walk at a great distance? I don't think they can train computers to do that yet. It's still a particularly human brain thing. But it's certainly a realistic touch as Jesus tells this perfectly crafted story. I don't know how it was set up, how you imagine it, but maybe just coming over the brow of a distant hill, you think. That's my boy there. And now also, so realistically, what we've had, lost, searched for, found and rejoiced, start to blur together. His father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. In fact, Jesus's hearers would have been astonished by that in various ways. First, there was the total insult that this son had given to his father. Our human instincts are to make sure that someone who is given that level of insult has to grovel. Yeah? But this father doesn't. Just stop and think about this for a moment. You probably know that the father in this story points us to God. tells us things about what he is like. Like the father in this parable, Jesus told, God insists that we face up to our sins. He did not try to stop the son leaving. He did not send a rescue party out to snatch him from the pigsty. First, the son must come to his senses. But when he came to himself, he said, although this is a humbling admission that he's having to make, I have sinned. It's a humbling admission that we have to make too. We have sinned. That sin has separated us from God. And Jesus is going to go on to show that none of the schemes that we can invent to ingratiate ourselves again with God will work. God, though, does not push us beyond humility into humiliation. Twice Jesus insisted that heaven throws a party when a sinner, you or me, comes back to God. Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So, first point of surprise here, the Father does not stand his ground here, arms closed. Sometimes body language does say something, and wait for him to come and grovel. Jesus' hearers were probably relishing the moment. But it doesn't happen. But it's not that the Father just welcomes his son back with a nod. It's not just that he welcomes his son back with open arms. He doesn't even just stand there. He doesn't even just walk out to the border of his now rather diminished property. Instead, he throws all dignity to the wind, tucks up his skirt of the robe, how unbecoming, and runs. He ran and embraced him and kissed him. Many years ago, I heard a report from an African setting about a particular man was being considered by a church to become its elder, or possibly pastor. They rejected him because he walked too fast. He was not a man of sufficient dignity. Every step he took should have resonated slow solidity. From what I understand, the Jewish culture of Jesus' day would have identified with that. So instead, Jesus is suggesting here that God could be accused of demeaning himself in unseemly exuberance in receiving people back, not merely as servants or slaves, but as family. He does not extract the penalty that everybody else seems to feel is due. And he won't accept his son's schemes either. Did you notice there is that prepared speech that the son has probably been going over and over in his head? I'm going to say this just right. But the father cuts across it. He says, treat me as one of your servants. No, son, you do not need to wheedle your way and manipulate your way back into my household. You cannot earn my favor that way, but you don't have to. Instead, I delight to give it freely, undeservedly, graciously. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no worthy to be called your son. But his father, he could even say, interrupted and said to the servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Don't think that this bypasses the cross, by the way. God doesn't just forgive sins. Jesus died on the cross to pay the spiritual debt that we've incurred. But it is that ridiculous, almost unseemly desire of God to forgive that led to the cross of Christ becoming the central point of all human history. That had to be if God was going to be able to forgive us freely. Jesus must pay everything so that we need pay nothing. And if we need pay nothing, that means it's open to all. But now, says the father in Jesus' story, now's the time to celebrate and party. Bring the fattened calf and kill it and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. And that's where Jesus's hearers, I think, would have expected the story to finish. They heard the story over in miniature a couple of times. There was the lost sheep, lost, searched for, found, rejoiced over. There's the lost coin, lost, searched for, found, rejoiced over. And there's this lost son, lost, sought, well, found and rejoiced over all in one. Yeah, that's a nice one, Jesus. Yeah, bit of a shock, that last one, though. But they all lived happily ever after. Well, I never. Nice story. But Jesus continues. Now his older son was in the field. Remember, there were two sons. The older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he asked one of the servants and called up one of the servants and asked what these things meant. Well, that's very reasonable. You would, wouldn't you? Hey, what's happening here? And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. And now's the moment, isn't it? Now's the moment we're about to realize there's not one, but there are two lost sons here. The question is whether the older son is going to join in with the party or not. Everything in the way Jesus has been telling things up to this point suggests that we are in for a happy ending. Remember, how does it go? Lost, sought, found, party time. The brothers have to end up united too, don't they? Because you can't break this mood. You can't break this theme, can you, Jesus? We know what's coming. But Jesus does break that celebratory mood. He has to, because of who he is telling this parable to. He has to expose that self-righteous spirit where there should have been all-round rejoicing. Remember back at the beginning of the chapter? This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. But he was angry and refused to go in. So this gracious father has to go out twice in the same day. Earlier, he ran out with delight. But this second time, I can't see him running, can you? All I can imagine is a sadness in his step as he walks gravely towards his second lost son. The son who thought that duty equals deserving in God's economy of grace. His father came out and entreated him. But his rejection of those entreaties shows a heart that really just does not understand grace, rejects grace even, because life is all about deserving, isn't it? What goes around comes around. And you can't treat him like that, because that's saying he's still as good as me. He spurned your love. I've earned your love. Look, all these many years I've served you, I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who's devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed a fattened calf for him. See, don't these words show that the older son really doesn't know a whole lot about gratitude or love, and certainly cannot or will not warm to the idea of grace. To give someone the very opposite of what they deserve, that's wrong. This wretch of a son of yours, notice he won't even recognize him as his brother. Someone like that needs to be made to grovel. And I'm never going to grovel. I will never need to grovel. But the older son does not have the final words. And yet the final words from the lips of this prodigal father don't actually come over to me as entirely final either. Thankfully. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. As if Jesus then turns to those Pharisees that we read about at the beginning of the chapter, grumbling about Jesus and his association with tax collectors and sinners. And he just raises an eyebrow, inviting them to agree with his assessment of things. Isn't it fitting to celebrate and be glad? And so Jesus, revealing in his actions and words the heart of the Father, capital F now, who sent him, has gone out to lost sons and lost daughters who have come to themselves. And they might only dare to hope they could find a place as one of the lowest servants, and yet they find themselves welcomed into the company of the King of Kings. And Jesus goes out again to the other lost sons and possibly daughters who refuse to go into the party. They disavow any association with people like that. Son, daughter, they've been lost and searched for and found and are being rejoiced over. Do you not realize that you're lost too? And I've left the party to come out here in the dark to find you too. The question is, are you going to allow yourself to be found? So folks, we saw last week that there are two ways to live. Today we've seen that there are different variations on how we can walk in one of those ways. You can be lost in a far country, and you can be just as lost, and perhaps even more so, if you stay dutifully at home. You can be lost by living riotously, and you can be just as lost, and perhaps even more, by living respectably. You can be lost by rejecting the true God, turning to almost any other religion, any kind of life, atheism, paganism, hedonism, whatever. And you can be just as lost, and maybe even more, by staying safely and self-righteously within the Christian religion, so long as you keep religion in its place. The question is not which way you're lost. It's whether, when the Son of God comes to you, will you let him find you? Will you let him save you? Will you let him rejoice over you? Let's pray, shall we?